Hello my friends and welcome back to another painting video. And in this painting video we're getting ready to rock out by painting Max Spleenripper, one of the Blood Bowl star players from the Games Workshop and the Forgeworld website. So this is a resin miniature and this guy's in a really cool rock and roll pose with his chainsaw and he's raring to go. So we're going to start as always by spending a little bit of time making sure that the skin looks great. This character with his hand up doing the horns has quite a really cool little bit of skin just around his arms. So if we spend a bit of time making the skin look as cool as possible, and then we'll get the other colours to really pop around there and make this miniature look great for both display and our games as well. So starting with the skin like I normally do, and if you followed some of my videos before, you'll notice that I'm using a similar sort of skin pattern that I've used previously. So I'm starting with the bellow beige red. This is a really good base colour, and this colour really does sort of allow you to sort of build highlights and build other tones up on top as well. So this is a really good thick colour to start with. And from there I'm also going to paint a little bit of red into the tongue and just in the mouth here as well. Just trying to be as careful as possible not to get red on too much of the model. And the good thing with these base colours is if you make any mistakes, it's easy to fix them at this stage anyway, so you don't have to be so crazy precise, but you want to try and be precise. And then I'm just going to do the teeth as well with a little bit of bone white, so this is my little off-white cream colour, and then I'm going straight in with a wash as well. So I'm just using with this one the Army Painter Flesh Wash. If you use Games Workshop and use Citadel, you can use a White Flesh Shade. That will do exactly the same thing for you. And with this one I've just added a tiny drop of water as well, just to make this a little bit more malleable and sort of easy to mimic and move around the miniature as well. So I'm just going to cover only the skin areas here, so just down the arm, just on the sides, the hands, the fingers, and of course the legs as well, because there is a little bit of skin showing just around the back of the knees as well. Well, once we've waited for that flesh wash to dry, that's given us a really dark sort of base colour for our skin. And from there now we're going to build those colours back up, and we're just going to tone these back through. And we're going to start by going back to that beige red. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time showing you sort of the brush strokes and things like that I'm using to build this colour up. Now I've added a little bit of water to all of these colours, so I've thinned these down slightly, just so that they are easier to manipulate onto the miniature, but they'll also blend together better. Because if you just use your colour and you just pop it straight onto the miniature without using it, without thinning it down, what you tend to find is you just end up with really big over-the-top sort of garish blobs of paint, and they won't transition into a smooth sort of highlight and a smooth sort of transition between those extreme contrasts between the darker tones and the lighter tones. So by thinning your paints, you get more for your paint on your brush because it lasts longer on your brush while you're painting. It's easier to move and manipulate around the model as well, and of course the transition then into the lighter colours also looks a lot smoother and a lot nicer on the eye. So as I said, just using a little bit of time just to show you sort of the brush strokes and things like that I'm using to paint this back in. So this is the first colour that we're going to use, and again if you've seen some of my other videos you'll kind of be getting a bit more used to how I'm painting skin now, and I'm trying to make it as easy to follow as possible. If you've seen me painting skin before, you're more than welcome to skip along to the next area, and I'll put some bullet points in so that it's nice and easy for you to follow and you don't have to keep watching me paint the same things over and over. But as I say, we're just wandering around and just painting this way around all of those sort of raised areas on the skin. So trying to leave the wash, as you can see just with the scarred area here, just trying to leave the wash sit and rest in that area while we just paint the colour around then, so that leaves the darker points just inside. So from there then we're just going to build up our next highlight, and as you can see, by using the paint nice and thin, this moves onto the miniature in a much nicer, more even way. And what I'm trying to do, as you can see, I'm trying not to cover everything that I've just painted, but just trying to cover a little bit. So I'm using now a little bit of a mixture, so I've got the beige red and the basic skin tone, and I've mixed these into the same amount, equal parts, so it's half and half. It's a 50-50 mix. So this is the next immediate sort of step up. Now by using that base colour and a highlight mixed together, what we're going to get is a nice, smoother, more even transition. And by doing that, that's going to allow us the ability to use our paints then to sort of allow us a smoother transition and something that's a little bit easier to follow and a little bit easier to look at. So when you're watching the model, when you're looking at the model, that skin is going to blend much, much nicer. As I said, it's going to look nicer than having just big blobs of highlights and colours and random bits here that look too bright and too over the top. And as I was saying earlier, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time showing you sort of the brush strokes and how I'm painting the skin and things like that. Something to remember when you're painting as well. When the paint goes onto the miniature and it's wet, it looks lighter than it dries. So when it dries down, it does darken slightly. So don't worry too much if it looks a little bit bright to begin with, because it will darken down as the paint just dries together and smooths out as well. So after that then we go into the next easiest transition, and we're just using the basic skin tone on its own. And as you can see, just on these little points of the muscle, I'm not painting over the whole thing, just painting sort of the top half, so about 50% of those little sort of muscly bulges, so that what we're getting is a smooth transition again, just between the lighter areas on top and the slightly darker areas down the bottom. But we're not making this such a big jump that again it's going to look too uneven. We're making this nice and smooth so that transition looks really natural and really smooth and looks really good. We're just going to do the same just across the bicep, as you can see. So just making some nice brush strokes. Doesn't matter too much about brush strokes when you're painting skin, because when the paint is nice and smooth like this, those highlights and those colours are going to be really sort of effective. It's going to look really nice. It's going to look really natural and work really, really well. So there you go, you can just see sort of those brush strokes working, and you can see just sort of where those highlights are coming in now, and where these sort of blends are starting to work, and where they're starting to look really, really nice. So for the next transition and the next step up, and just using the top part of those muscles, as you can see just across those bulges, I'm using that basic skin tone again, but I've mixed now halfway a little bit of light flesh into that as well. So this is a 50-50 mix again, making it a nice easy step up, so something that's very, very easy to follow, something that's very easy to sort of build up and gradually progress through. And that should be the skin complete. So moving on to part 2, once you've got your skin finished and the skin is dry and it's starting to look really, really good, we're now going to apply all of the base colours, and we're going to start by using a khaki colour. So this is just using on the tabard on the inside. So he's got a few different layers of clothing, and from what I can see looking at the box art, we've got a tabard just inside. So we're just going to cover this in a nice basic khaki colour. This is going to make it stand out from that skin, but also be nice and bright and sort of stand away from the extreme sort of purple colours and things that we're going to paint sort of the front part of the tabard as well. So just painting around, just trying to avoid getting any of this khaki on the skin. We've spent so long getting that skin built up that we want to try and avoid getting any of the paints on the skin now. But the good thing with using watered down paints is if you accidentally do touch a little bit of the skin, you can just use a little bit of water to drag that paint back off and save it. So don't worry too much. Now once that khaki is complete, you're going to build up the trousers and the boots as well, and I'm using for this a heavy charcoal, so this is a really, really dark grey colour. It's not quite black, but you can tell that it's a grey colour. It's very, very dark colour, and this is a great base colour to start with, because once we start building those colours up and those highlights back up, we're going to get a lot of sort of character and definition from this base colour. So just being careful again not to get any of this onto the skin, because this is so dark, this will affect the skin quite a bit. And I'm just painting this, as you can see, in nice thin coats just across those areas, trying to be as careful as possible. Now from there I'm going to paint one of my favourite colours, and this colour is part of the Vallejo Panzer Aces range, and this colour is a dark rust, that's what they call it, and it's a really, really dark brown, and it's a brilliant, brilliant base colour. It applies to the miniature in a nice consistent coat, and what that means is because it applies in a nice consistent coat, so when you thin it down it runs onto the miniature really smoothly and really lovely. It means then that this is the perfect colour that you can build highlights from. So when you paint in dark brown colours or leather straps or things like that, this is a really good base colour to start with. This is why I use it so often in my videos, because I find this is such a good colour to build up from. And that's all I'm doing with this one, is just painting all of those straps. So the leather straps around the arms, the legs, the one that's going like a sash just down across his body, and again just being careful not to get any of this brown on the skin that we've worked so hard for. You just want to be as careful as possible and try to get the brown and try to get the paint, especially on these little sort of belts and buckles and things just across the arms. It's just to be careful with the belt and the arms, the arm skin colour sort of transition together. And then we're going to move on to the top layer of that tabard. So the top layer of that tabard, I'm using a violet red. Now I'm going to use a couple of coats on this because this colour does take a couple of coats to apply properly and evenly. So as you can see, it's a little bit thin, but that doesn't matter. 2 or 3 coats and it'll be fine. It'll look perfect. And this violet red is kind of the closest thing that I found using a Vallejo colour to the box art, and once we get this painted up, this colour is really going to pop on the miniature as well. It's really going to make him stand out. This guy being a chaos kind of character, he's going to have similar sort of textures and tones to the Chaos Bloodspawn that I had painted on my channel a little while back. So some of the trousers and things like that are going to be quite similar, and some of the armor panels are going to be quite similar as well. So having this violet red really makes him stand out, because not only have we got these nice bright red colours here, we're also going to have this purpley tone as well, just to make him a little bit more unique and his own character, which is great. That's exactly what we want. So, as I said, when I painted the Chaos Bloodspawn, I was using the gory red for the armor panels. So to tie this one in with the same army and with the same Blood Bowl set that I've got, I'm using the same colour to paint those armor panels and the chainsaw as well. So all these little bits of armor on the knee pads and things like that, painting them in this gory red. Now gory red is a great colour from Vallejo because it has a really cool glow to it. It really shines. So when you place this on the model, it really does sort of, it almost looks like the paint is still wet when the paint is actually dry. And that's really cool because that's going to give it like a kind of shiny armour effect as well. Now once that's complete and we've dried the reds, we're then going to apply some of the silvers. Now I'm using true metallic metals for this one. You can use non-metallic metals if you want. There will probably be a few more videos where I paint non-metallic metals as well. But for the sake of this video, because I've already painted some of the Blood Bowl team up in this way, I'm going to paint this one in a similar way. So I'm using true metallic metals because they're a little bit easier to deal with, especially when you're painting large groups of miniatures. If you've only got one to do, non-metallic metals are great, but they do take a lot of time. So for this one I'm just using gunmetal. This is a really good sort of dark silver colour. It's actually a really similar colour to Citadel's Lead Belcher. So again, it's a really good colour to build up from because it already starts in a dark sort of mid-tone. And this applies to the miniature quite thickly, so it's always good to thin this one down and just be very careful where you're applying it and things like that. And when it comes to true metallic metals, something that is worth keeping an eye on, or something that's worth thinking about, is because metallic paints tend to be quite thick and they can dry quite thick as well. Sometimes it's always good, sometimes it's a good idea to use different paintbrushes for metallic colours as to the paintbrushes you'd use for things like your skin colours and your base colours. Only because if you apply a little bit too much if you paint too much paint on your brush and you find that that's getting into parts of the brush and drying the brush out, you're not ruining some of your more specific detail brushes then. So I tend to use 2 different brushes. I'll use one for metallics just in case, and then I'll use one for all the details and things like that on the skin and bits like that. Now once the silver's dry, we're just going to go back and use that bone white once more, just painting the skulls and of course doing the teeth again and things like that, just highlighting them just a little bit more after the shade has been in from the skin. So as you can see, I'm just painting the laces as well the same colour, so we're going to use bone white as the base coat for the laces. And once we've done the skulls and the laces and bits like that, we're going to move on and just do all of the bits that we need to do in the other true metallic metal that we're doing. So for this one, we're just using a brass colour. And I'm going to paint all of the symbols and paint little bits of the chainsaw as well. So as you can see, the majority of the chainsaw has been done in a silver, but I'm actually going to go around the edges of the chainsaw and paint those in a brass as well. And the cool thing by mixing these metallic colours is it gives you a real good sort of eye-catching effect. Silver is quite striking anyway, but when you mix a nice bronzy, copper, brass kind of colour onto these, you do end up with a really cool sort of like eye-catching contrast. They look really amazing. So it's a really cool, quick and easy way of getting your miniature to really pop is by using a combination of sort of true metallics in this way. So I'm just trying to be careful here as well. So as I was mentioning earlier about sort of the leather straps, you want to be very careful as to where you're applying your metallics so that they don't end up on the skin, especially around the hand where he's holding onto that chainsaw, because it can get a little bit sort of dicey around that area. I'm just trying to do some of the details as well using the same colour. So the brass, as I said earlier, if you followed the video that I painted the Chaos Spawn, you'll notice that it's a very similar sort of effect. We're using that gory red on the outside of the armour, and then that's just brandished with the sort of brass colour just around the edges here, and it looks really good. It makes, as I said earlier, the miniature really pop. It really stands out. So I'm painting up some of the symbols as well while I'm here, just across the chain and across the neck area as well. And once all of those base colours are done, we're now going to be quite careful in where we apply and how we apply our wash. So I'm just putting this wash or shade or anything like that, depending on how you say it, just putting a little bit of Citadel's Null Oil on this one. So Null Oil is a black wash. And this is going to tone the colours down, and that's fine, that's cool, because we're going to tone those colours back up in a little bit anyway. So all of the colours that I've done, to tie them in together, I'm using the same wash on all of them. But the thing to remember with this, the most important thing, is don't get your Null Oil wash, your black wash, onto the skin. So this is where it gets really fiddly. It's just around the hand on the chainsaw, as I was saying earlier. And especially just around the back of the knee pads as well, because you're going to want to apply a small layer of this just onto those straps, but you don't want it to get onto the skin. So just be very careful where you're applying. So just use the tip of your brush and try to use a thin layer. And that's step 2 done. So moving on to part 3. And part 3, now that our shade has dried down, we're going to rebuild those colours as I was saying. So we're going to rebuild those colours back up and get this model now to really pop. And this is all about highlighting and getting that contrast between the lights and darks. So we're going back to the base colours that we started with, and we're going to build those up first, and then we're going to build those highlights on top of that as well. So for the boots and for the trousers, we're going to start by going back with that heavy charcoal. So we're just going around and just using the heavy charcoal to paint in some of the areas that are sticking out, but while trying to leave that shade, that black wash in those recess points where it's pooled. And the reason for that is because the black wash on that grey is just going to tone it down a little bit. And then as we paint in these back up, it's creating that element of folds and depth and things like that into our miniature, which is fantastic because that's kind of what we want. We're kind of building that illusion of depth between those folds, the cracks, the creases, and all those different things. So we're just building it up like so. Again, you want to try and be very careful when you're applying this, especially around the back of the knees where the skin is as well. Just to be careful that you don't get any of this onto the skin, because as we build in now, this is where the progression is going. So we're moving on to just using our first highlight onto the grey areas. And with the first highlight, just using a slightly different colour to any colour that I've used in any of my other videos before. And what I'm doing is I'm just mixing in a colour called a Sombra Grey. And that's kind of a bluish grey. So by adding this into that heavy charcoal, not only are we keeping that darkness, but we're just adding a little bit of blue into this now. So we're kind of getting a little bit of a blue-grey kind of feel to it, which is quite cool because it's giving us a really sort of like muted sort sort of cool down colour, and that's going to be great, especially in contrast to those bright reds and that bright sort of purpley red. It's going to be a really cool sort of like contrast between the warm and dark colours then. So this should be a cool little offset, and hopefully this will work out in that sort of way. So again, just being very careful, painting the highlighted points and trying to avoid where that the sort of darker recesses are, trying to avoid where the folds are, as you can see. And again, it's cool because I'm using a thin down colour. We kind of ending up with some nice sort of more even and equal transitions into the colour, so that it's not too over the top. So again, we're mixing more of that sombre grey in. As you can see, that sombre grey is quite bright, it has quite an effect. Don't forget what I said though, when paints do dry, they do tend to dry down a little bit darker, but this one is going to stand out amazingly well. It's going to look really, really cool. So I'm just going around now, and I'm not worried about sort of my my brush strokes, because they add into like the scratchy sort of folded sort of way that the clothes are folding around. And there you go, as you see, just slowly building up those thin layers just around the boots now, trying to avoid where all of those dark bits are and all of the detail bits are. And you can really see sort of like that blue-grey sort of colour coming out of this now, which is great because it's given us something completely different to sort of catch our eye as well. So we know that he's wearing dark grey sort of trousers, but it's just giving us that little bit of a pop, just something a little bit more to look at. And there we go, now that the trousers are all dried up and the boots are all looking pretty snazzy, we're going to move on now and just try to build up the tabard once more. So we're just going to build that khaki back up, trying to use those folds, as you can see. So just trying to use where that the washers sort of sat in those folds. So we're creating that element of movement through the miniature just by painting on the raised areas. Just like so. We're going to do the same thing on the front and the back. I apologise about the flickering of the light. That's just where my camera is trying to adjust while I'm kind of taking up a lot of the light from my lamp as well. So just show you again on the back here as we go. So just trying to paint the raised areas and just leaving a little bit for the creases, because by leaving a little bit on those creased areas, it's creating that depth, and as I said, it's showing the flow of the fold and kind of giving the model a little bit more dynamism than just standing still. Once that stage is dry, just going to build up the next point, which is just a little bit of a highlight, and it's the same thing again. We're just using that khaki once more, and we're just adding a little bit of bone white into the mix this time. So we're going to do a little bit of a half and half once more, so just a nice simple 50-50. I mean, the more you paint and the more you add these little mixtures in, the more used to it you get. I tend to like doing 50-50 mixes because it gives enough of the base colour that it doesn't look too over the top, but it gives enough highlight that it just allows that highlight to smoothly pop and smoothly transition through the highlighting stage. So it's a good way to practice, just using half and half and just going up in sort of half stages, half stops. It's a good way to sort of build your blending sort of techniques and sort of learning from there. And then once again, we're just going to move on to the front part of that tabard now, and just using that violet red once more. We're just going to build this back up, nice and smooth transitions, a few different layers. And the cool thing with this is that Null Noil has darkened this down enough that as we put multiple layers on, we're going to have the ability to manipulate how and where we want that highlight to sort of build. So we can build the highlight more across the edges should we want, and leave a little bit more of that darkness just down the middle. As you can see, I'm just painting that highlight just back up and just across the middle, just across the edges here. Sometimes I'll use a little bit of a stippling technique. As you can see, I was just dabbing just across the edges, and that's purely just to add a little bit of, again, more texture and more sort of definition to the miniature, rather than just always using straight lines. And again, just building up that gory red again. So we're going in, as you can see, where that washer sat is kind of darkened things down and dulled things down a bit. So I'm just building that gory red back up. I'm just using a stippling technique, as I was saying here. I'm just adding a little bit of red in sort of a stippling technique, so that gives the armour a little bit more of a kind of like a battered look. So this is just kind of like it's been sort of used, it's a little bit worn. You know, if you're using straight lines a lot, then your armour might look quite uniformed. So just by adding a little bit of stippling onto that armour can add a little bit more worn look to it and make it look a little bit more well used as well. So again, that's a really cool little tip and a little cool technique that you can use to build up texture and tone in a very, very simple, quick and easy way. There we go, so just across the side pad, and of course just across the knee pads as well. Now once that point is done, you can add a little bit of a highlight into the gory red. Now with the gory red, it can be something that if you add a little bit too much in, it can turn very, very pink very, very quickly. So the last thing you want to do is add too much in. So what I tend to do is I'm using dead white, which if you followed videos of me before, is one of my favourite colours to mix into other colours. Because dead white has a real nice bright vibrancy to it. It actually brings the vibrancy of other colours out quite nicely as well. And what I'm doing is I'm just using a very thin coat of this, and I'm using this in a very, very thin stippled layer. And the reason for this is, again, just building that sort of battered and worn textured look, and it's gonna look really nice when it's done. So we're just gonna build this up in a nice, slow, progressive way. So just by using a mixture of the stippling effect, as I was saying about building that sort of battered look, you can also just use a little bit across those edges to create sort of an edge highlight as well, and just pick out those real extreme details just across the edges. And from there as well, we're also then just going to build up the colours back on those metallics. So just using the gunmetal again, going back to that silver, and just using a very controlled and very light sort of dry brush, just to try and get that silver to sort of shine a little bit more, just across the teeth of the chainsaw, and across those shoulder spikes as well, and across the chain that's holding the chainsaw in as well. Now I say being very controlled with this, because it is easy to let this get a little bit out of control by using a brush that's too big, or by going a little bit extreme with a dry brush and then getting silver onto bits that you don't want silver on. So you just want to take your time, use a small brush, use less. Something that I always say to people when using sort of dry brushing, less is more. So if you use a very small amount of colour on your brush and then gently build up to it, rather than going a bit too much and too extreme and it being too bright, you kind of want to build up slowly and gently. So less is more. So make sure that there's only a very small amount of colour on your brush when you're using that dry brush then. And then just using a highlight once again, doing exactly the same thing, so just using a very small brush, and I'm just going on with silver now instead of the gunmetal. And silver is a much brighter colour, so again, less is more, and just building, slowly building that colour up in small stages and small increments, and it will look a lot better than just going too extreme. And I'm also just using a little bit of that silver again, just to highlight across those belt buckles, and of course the little buckle that we've got across the sash on the leather across the front. And for the belt buckles, I'm just trying to be very careful again, not to catch any of the skin. And of course I'm also using it just to highlight very gently the little sort of rivets and things like that across the belt as well. And those, being on the really sort of shiny silver, they are really going to stand out and look the part, and really draw your eye's attention onto those points as well. So going back to that brass again, and in the same way, we're just using that brass now, and we're just going to build that up, leaving sort of a little bit around those rivets and points on the armour. And I'm just using a stippling technique again, so just dabbing the very tip of the brush, as you can see, not being too extreme or too worried about using sort of thin lines or smooth layers or anything like that. This is more about just dabbing and using this brush to stipple, so that it creates a little bit more of a mechanical, sort of broken, worn, battered sort of metal effect. And this is going to look a lot better and a lot more worn, and give it a little bit more character than just putting the colour back on then. So as you can see, I'm just gently sort of dabbing the very edge of that brush, just kind of creating that element of a sort of beaten up, worn sort of metal colour as well, which is great. And we're going to highlight that as well, I believe. So we're going to use just be very careful sort of where you're placing. No. Start again. 3, 2, 1. And so, yeah, just using that stippling technique, as I say, we're just going across all of those areas where that brass colour is. Just being very careful as well, sort of across the armour. As you can see, you've got some rivets and things like that. You don't want the brass colour to detract from where the wash is sat, just sort of around those rivets, creating that depth and that texture. And again, in a similar way, we're just going to go back onto that leather, and as you can see, I'm using very, very thin light colour now. So I'm going with the dark rust that we used originally, but I've mixed in a little bit of that leather brown as well. And I've mixed in a little bit of that leather brown so that the transition is a little bit more even. And that's all I'm doing, is just using a nice thin down colour, and I'm just trying to catch scratchy points and just, again, dabbing and scraping just the very, very tip of that brush, just creating a little bit more of a beaten and worn look to that leather, because we don't want to paint this straight over the top and create the leather to change the colour and make it too flat. We want to use the edge of that brush and just make scratches and tones and things like that, so it means that the leather will look a lot more battered and worn again, because when we're painting, we don't want everything to look too smooth, and especially in certain games as well. So something like a Chaos Guy in a game called Blood Bowl, you don't want everything to look smooth and lovely and lavish. You kind of want things to be a bit more beaten up and rough and ready and things like that as well. By all means, you can make the colours pop, but that doesn't mean that everything's got to look nice and pretty. We're just going to highlight those areas where we've used the brass, and by highlighting the brass, what I'm actually doing is just putting a small amount of polished gold into that brass, and again, just using that stippling technique, this is just going to build up a little bit of a highlight and just give that brass a little bit more of a shine, especially just across those edges. It's just going to make that brass really, really sort of stand out, and this is the beauty by using true metallic metals as opposed to non-metallic metals, is it does give off a really, really good shine. Now I know it's not for everyone, and some people prefer using the non-metallics, and that's completely fine. As I always say, they're your miniatures, you can paint them how you want, but for certain projects I like different things, and this is a little bit of an easier way just to get those colours to really, really sort of shine and stand out and really sort of look great under sort of different lighting conditions and things like that. So yeah, just using that stippling just to build up a little bit of a highlight on that brass. Now we're going to go back in with the bone white here, and we're just going to start to build up those laces again. We're just going to be very, very careful, just using a thin down colour again, nice and easy, very tip of the brush, and just build those laces up using the same colour. Now while we're here, we're also going to build up those skulls as well, and again we're going to try and leave some of the darker areas, so in the eye sockets, in the nose, just around the sort of side of the skull and things like that as well. It's just going to try and build our highlight through and build that up as much as we can. As you can see, trying to avoid letting any of that bone white sit into the cracks in the skull, as you can see there. Perfect. And from there again, we're going to highlight once more. So we're going to use a colour that I use quite a lot when I'm highlighting bone white, because bone white is a cream sort of white colour, not a white colour. We're going to use a sort of creamy highlight colour for this as well. So a colour that matches quite nicely, but has a really nice sort of build to it. So we're going to use something called an elfic flesh. And this is a really nice cream colour, but it has this really nice vibrancy. So when you're painting around the skulls, it's great to just pick out things like the eye sockets, just across the top of the skull, the teeth and things like that. And this is really going to make those areas of the skull really, really, really stand out. And you could go further then as well with an extreme sort of white highlight just on those extreme edges around the skull eyes and things like that. It depends on how far you want to push it and how comfortable you are pushing those extreme highlights. But you can see I'm just being very careful with the teeth there and just using the very, very tip of the brush. Now for one of the sort of highlights that I've sort of held back off towards the end is just using sort of this violet red. Now I was a little bit conscious with this violet red, because if you add too much sort of highlight into this violet red, you kind of change the sort of undercolour from that violet red into something a little bit more sort of purpley or pinky colour, which you kind of don't want to go too extreme with. So I'm using a little bit of that dead white that I mentioned earlier, just for that vibrancy and to make that colour pop a little bit. But I'm just being very, very, very careful as well, just to use this as more of like an edge highlight. So I'm not trying to go too extreme, and I'm just going down the sides of the tabard and just around the front edge here, and just across the folds, but without going too extreme and covering too much of the model. One of the hardest and most fiddly parts is actually painting around the eye sockets here, and if you do paint a little bit too much, so if you do think that when you put this highlight on that it's highlighting too much, don't worry, just go back to the original violet red and just gently paint that back in just to cover and colour those sort of mid-tones back. And I'm just popping a little bit of bloody red just onto his tongue, and that's my go-to highlight. I like a bloody red highlight just on top of the normal red. It pops really, really nicely. And as one of the final stages, we've done the skin already, but what we're going to do is just water down a purple wash. So for this I'm using a purple tone. You can use a Druky Violet if you want from Citadel, it'll do the same thing. And I'm just using this as a glaze. So I've used a bit of water in this, quite a bit, to make this flow really, really thin. And that's all I'm doing is I'm just going to paint over these areas of the skin where the veins are popping out, and also just on that scar on the back as well, and that's going to tie that in, make it a little bit more purple, build these veins to pop out of the miniature, but also tie them in a little bit to the model as well, especially with that violet red on the tabard. Now, as an optional stage as well, you can also add a few washes and inks and things like that onto certain areas of the chainsaw to dirty it up, rust it up and things like that. So I've used a sepia ink on this one. You don't have to, you can if you want, but you can add different colours and tones, blue washes, orange washes, create sort of like oily sort of effects and all things like that. And all in all, when he's completed, when you get to this stage, you should have something that looks similar to this. And all in all, that's not bad. I think this is a great looking miniature, especially considering I'm using Vallejo paints to paint the box art as well. I like the true metallic metals. I think they really pop, they stand out. That skin looks really nice and blended. And you'll have to let me know in the comments what you think overall. As always, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your continued support.